Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am introducing a new video series on this channel that I probably should have thought of a snappy name for before I sat down to film. I'll have to figure that out. But basically, this is a sort of idea for a reading project slash video series that I've been mulling over a while because there is a category of books that I really want to be reading that I'm sort of putting off constantly, sort of subconsciously, because I feel like the way I want to read those books does not match up with my booktube channel wrap-up format. And that category of books is multi-author anthologies, especially like big chunky ones. A lot of anthologies are books that I would like to read over a relatively long period of time, dipping in and out of them. I don't necessarily want to sit down and read a bunch of authors' short stories, even maybe on the same theme, like all in a row. I own many anthologies, and I would kind of like to be reading them in such a way that I sort of have one going at all times on the back burner that I can pick up and read a couple stories when I want to. But if I do this without changing something about my booktube channel format, I'm going to have a really hard time wrapping those books up, especially if I finish reading them long after I started and don't remember the early stories by the time I get to the end. Also, I own a couple of anthologies that are just like so massive that reading them would have to be an entire reading project by themselves, and there is no way I'm going to want to sit down and talk about all those stories in one video, or even like have to figure out how to pick out highlights. In addition, with the way I've been consistently running months and months behind on my monthly wrap-ups for the last year or two, I just keep feeling like if I read these books, I won't be able to talk about them the way I want to by the time I get to them in a wrap-up. So the idea is this. I will always be reading an anthology of some sort, and every few stories, maybe every 5 stories is my idea right now, but that might grow or shrink a bit, I'll stop and do a little video and talk to you about just those like 5 stories. This will be especially fun because I'll get to talk about several different authors' writing in each video, and talk about whether I've read something else by that author, if I haven't, if this story makes me want to pick up something else, and whether the stories that I'm talking about have been reprinted or previously printed somewhere else that you might read them if you are interested in them outside of their collection in this particular anthology. So the first book that I want to cover in this video series is actually not one of the super massive ones that I own that's taking up my shelf space. It is one that I have out from the library on interlibrary loan, hence this little jacket thing on it that I'm not allowed to take off. But this is The Green Man, Tales from the Mythic Forest, edited by Datlow and Terri Windling, with this beautiful cover art by Charles Vess. It also has individual like little chapter heading illustrations for each story, also by Vess. I believe this is out of print in print format, but it was recently, just earlier this year, reissued as an ebook. The ebook doesn't have the Charles Vess cover. I don't know if it has the internal illustrations or not. But anyways, this was published in 2002, and I'm reading it now because earlier in the year it was a group pick for a Goodreads group that I'm a member of called Into the Forest, which I'll link down below, that reads books inspired by folklore, fairy tales, and mythology. I put an interlibrary loan on it at that time, right before the library shut down for the pandemic, and it was only recently that several library branches in my library system have reopened for pickup and drop-off, and the interlibrary loan office sent me an email saying, hey, you have an interlibrary loan item that came in while the library was closed. Do you still want it? And I said yes. So I'm actually planning on reading this book fairly quickly, as opposed to having it on the back burner for a long time, dipping in and out of it, because it is a library item, it's an interlibrary loan, and I will need to return it fairly soon. But I nevertheless thought it would be a good book for starting off this video series. All of the stories and poems in this book were original to this anthology, although the book is old enough now that a number of them have been reprinted in various places. I cannot guarantee that I will have found every place that every story in this book has ever been reprinted just from a Google search, though. And so I have read both the introduction by Terri Windling And the first 5 pieces in this book, I'm saying pieces instead of stories because one of them is a poem. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here in this video, the introduction and first 5 pieces of this book. Terri Windling's introduction is called About the Green Man and Other Forest Lore, and it is a very scholarly piece of writing that I found fascinating. I should really read more fairy tale and folklore scholarship because I really enjoy it. The theme of this book, based on the title, is ostensibly the Green Man, but it's actually significantly broader than that. The Green Man specifically is a reference to a type of figure that is carved into a lot of European churches that is a little bit mysterious in origin, that's a leafy face with like leaves coming out of its mouth. And for a while, scholars thought that this was a representation of a folkloric figure like Jack in the Green or something. And this idea of the Green Man arose around it, but I think scholars these days sort of question that leap in reasoning. Nevertheless, the idea of the Green Man has sort of become symbolic of the idea that there's a powerful mythic figure of the wild wood. And so this book actually takes a very broad approach to the idea of the Green Man, and the authors were clearly invited to take on anything from the wide range of forest gods and tree spirits that folklore and mythology has to offer. And so this introduction gives a pretty big rundown of all of the sort of mythic and folkloric figures, mostly European. It's a pretty Eurocentric introduction that are associated with this idea of the primal wild wood. And it sort of follows that development in literature through fantasy classics to the modern day, and I was pleasantly surprised how many of the books that were name dropped at the end of this intro I had actually read, and I'm interested to see which ones that I hadn't read or haven't heard of also were mentioned. Now, the first actual piece in the collection is a very short poem by Neil Gaiman called Going Wodwo. In the author's note, he notes that a Wodwo is a medieval wild man, sometimes associated with the idea of the Green Man, and the poem is super duper short, and it's basically about the idea of leaving everything behind and going into the woods to become a wild man. It's a very fitting introduction for the collection, but it doesn't leave much of an impact on its own. I don't know that it's been reprinted anywhere officially, but there are definitely lots of people who have like posted it as a little poem on their blogs and stuff, so I'll link somewhere below where you can read it. Next is Grand Central Park by Delia Sherman, which I think I had very, very high expectations for, so I was disappointed in it because it seemed like such my thing. It's about a teenage girl who has like a scary encounter with a modern urban fairy queen character in Central Park and has to like match wits with her in order to be freed, which is a sort of staple of fae stories, and it definitely takes this approach that like, yes, there can be fairy magic in places like New York City, and I was immediately like, yes, please, woohoo, give me more of that, but the story wasn't really anything special, I didn't feel like. I should note that this one does have some fat phobia in it, both expressed towards the main character and internalized. I'm not aware of this having been published anywhere else. I think one of the other reasons that I had very high expectations for this story and was let down is because I have liked Delia Sherman's short fiction in the past, and I do really want to read some of her other books. I own a story collection by her, Young Woman in a Garden, I think. So that's on my TBR. Next is Daphne by Michael Cadnum, who's an author I had never heard of, and I don't think I'll be seeking out his other work. This is pretty short. It is a fairly straightforward retelling of the myth of Daphne and Apollo, told from Daphne's point of view. She's the one who is pursued by Apollo and turns into a laurel tree to avoid him. Content warning on this for sexual harassment. This was very meh. I didn't have very strong feelings about it. It was just a pretty straightforward Daphne and Apollo retelling. But it was, I think, very elegantly written, I'll give it that. Somewhere in my mind there is a painting box by Charles De Lent. This was the longest of the first 5 pieces in this collection that I read, and I think it was also my favorite. This is a Newford story. Newford is the fictional city where Charles De Lent has set a vast number of novels and stories that are mythic urban fantasy. This one isn't really urban fantasy because it doesn't take place in the city. It kind of takes place out in the woods in the hills by Newford somewhere. Obviously, because this is a forest-themed anthology. I take it this has the same protagonist as The Cats of Tanglewood Forest, which is a middle-grade novel, also illustrated by Charles Vess, which I recently bought a copy of. I have not yet read it, but it is beautiful and has beautiful illustrations. But this story follows her several years later when she's a teenager. The publication chronology is a little confusing here, though, because this book was actually published before this one, but after a picture book called A Circle of Cats, which was the sort of predecessor to this one. This is sort of a novelization of A Circle of Cats that takes the same story and fleshes it out more. This story is about Lily, who is an aspiring artist who lives with the woman who raised her in a cabin in the hills, and the history of two Newford artists who went missing 20 years prior when they went on a painting expedition into selfsame hills. It introduces two sort of mythic tree spirits, a lady of the wood and an apple tree man, and the pieces of this story at first felt a little disjointed, but I thought they came together really beautifully. It ends up being about art and magic, and about whether it's better to yearn for fairyland or to see the magic in the real world around you, and how art ultimately has the power to capture and show that magic. I thought it was really lovely. This story has also been collected in Muse and Reverie, which is one of the Newford story collections. I think it's the 13th Newford book, and it is also available to purchase independently on its own as an ebook. And then the last story that I've read so far in this collection is Among the Leaves So Green by Tanith Lee. Tanith Lee is a super classic author of adult fairy tale fiction that I'm sort of embarrassed that I haven't read more of her. I was sort of turned off by the first short story of hers I read, which I think was in the Snow White Blood Red anthology by the same editors. I also know I read one of her YA books as a kid and really didn't like it, although I remember absolutely nothing about it except that I didn't like it. So I've been slow to pick up more of her fiction. I did end up liking this story. It's another longer one. I think both this one and the previous story, in my mind, There's a Painting Box, are both novelettes. And it's a take on the fairy tale trope of like the good sister and the bad sister. The two girls in this story are the daughters of a village prostitute, and one of them is very mean and one of them is very sweet. And it takes a long time before it gets around to subverting that trope, but it does by the end. Their mother sends both of them into the woods on an errand, and they run into a god of the forest. This one also has some random awesome witches. I think I wouldn't have actually minded if this had been expanded into like a novella-length story to give each of these two girls a more fleshed out storyline. There are some things that seem very, very rushed in order to get to the next point. But I started out this story sort of assuming I was going to dislike it, and I ended up pleasantly surprised by the end. So there you have it. Those are the first 5 stories I'm going to talk about in this new anthology video series. Just to give you a little taste of what's to come after I finish this book. I do have an anthology on my Kindle that I started reading a couple years ago and then put aside that I haven't gotten back to, in part because, gosh, I don't know how I'll wrap this up when I read some of these stories 2 years ago. That's one of the Clockwork Phoenix anthologies from Mythic Delirium, edited by Mike Allen, and I don't remember which one. But that's definitely on the list to get through the rest of the stories in that anthology. And then the book that sort of sparked this whole idea for me when I got this book and was like, I have no idea how I'm going to deal with this on my channel when I read it, is the Big Book of Classic Fantasy, edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, which is massive, tiny print, and takes like a sweeping view of the history of fantasy literature. I am so excited to read this, but also so daunted, and I think that having this anthology video series is going to help me be less daunted about reading this if I only have to worry about like 5 stories at a time. And then the other massive beast of an anthology that I was just never going to read if I didn't have a good way to talk about it bit by bit on the channel is Worlds Seen in Passing 10 Years of Tor.com short fiction. So these two are definitely in the lineup, but I actually have like quite a lot of anthologies on my TBR, and I am very excited to have this way to not be intimidated by them. Anyhow, let me know what you think about anthologies, how you go about reading them. Let me know if you have any thoughts about how many stories you want to see covered in one of these videos at a time. I'm sort of starting with 5, but open to possibilities. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.